There are moments when hope is all a person has left, when the last coins in your pocket and a ticket to somewhere unknown represent the only chance at a future worth living. This is a story about such a moment. Set in the frozen winter of 1876, when a young woman with nothing but hope boarded a train heading west to marry a stranger she had never met. It is a story about how the harshest season of the year can bring the warmest miracles, about how two broken people found wholeness in each other, and about one Christmas Eve when everything changed. The woman's name was Sarah Mitchell, though by the time this story reaches its heart, she would carry a different name and a different life. The man was called Daniel Crawford, a rancher who had lost so much that he had forgotten how to feel anything but emptiness. What happened between them in a small cabin on the Wyoming frontier proved that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped not in ribbons and paper, but in courage, kindness, and the willingness to see another person's true worth when the rest of the world has looked away. This is their story, a tale of how hope and blessing found each other on the loneliest night of the year. Sarah Mitchell was 24 years old when she stepped onto the train in Philadelphia with a single worn carpetbag containing everything she owned in the world. She had been a seamstress in the city, working 14 hours a day in a factory where the air was thick with lint, and the pay was barely enough to cover a cramped room in a boarding house where rats scratched in the walls at night. Sarah's parents had died from fever when she was 17, leaving her alone with no family and no prospects beyond the grinding poverty that consumed so many young women in the crowded cities of the East. For 7 years she had endured that life, her hands becoming rough and scarred from the needles, her eyes straining in the dim factory light, her spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of hopelessness. When a friend showed her an advertisement from a matrimonial agency, Sarah had stared at it for 3 days before making her decision. The advertisement described men on the frontier seeking wives, offering a chance at a new life in the West where land was plentiful and futures were possible. It was a gamble, a terrifying leap into the unknown, but Sarah understood that staying in Philadelphia meant dying slowly, and she would rather take a chance on living, even if that chance might break her heart. The matrimonial agency connected Sarah with Daniel Crawford, a rancher in Wyoming territory who had lost his wife to childbirth 2 years earlier, along with the baby she had been carrying. Daniel's letters were brief and practical, describing his ranch and his need for a wife to help manage the household. There was no poetry in his words, no romance or sweet promises, just honest statements about the hard life on the frontier and the work that would be required. Sarah appreciated the honesty, even as it frightened her. She wrote back describing her skills as a seamstress, her willingness to work hard, and her hope for a better life than the one she was leaving behind. Daniel sent money for her train passage, and Sarah packed her few belongings with hands that shook between fear and excitement. She left Philadelphia on a gray December morning, watching the city disappear behind her as the train carried her toward a future she could not imagine. The journey took nearly 2 weeks, with Sarah changing trains multiple times and spending her last few coins on bread and cheese to eat along the way. As the landscape changed from crowded cities to endless plains covered in snow, Sarah felt like she was traveling to another world entirely, leaving behind everything familiar and stepping into a story whose ending she could not predict. The train arrived in the small town of Hollow Creek, Wyoming on December 23rd, and Sarah stepped down onto the platform with her carpetbag clutched tight in her freezing hands. The cold was unlike anything she had experienced in Philadelphia, a bitter wind that cut through her thin coat and made her bones ache. She looked around the nearly deserted platform, searching for the man who was supposed to meet her, the stranger who would become her husband. After several long minutes of growing panic, a tall figure appeared from the general store across the street and walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Daniel Crawford was a man in his early 30s with brown hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He was not handsome in the conventional way, but there was something solid and dependable in how he carried himself. He stopped a few feet away from Sarah and looked at her with eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. He asked if she was Sarah Mitchell, and when she nodded, he picked up her carpetbag without another word and gestured toward a wagon waiting nearby. The silence between them was heavy and uncomfortable as Daniel helped Sarah onto the wagon seat and then climbed up beside her. He clucked to the horses, and they began the journey to his ranch, 6 miles outside of town through snow-covered terrain that looked beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Sarah tried several times to start a conversation during that cold wagon ride, asking Daniel about his ranch and the area. But his answers were short and distant, as if talking required more energy than he possessed. Sarah felt her hope beginning to crack around the edges, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in coming all this way to marry a man who seemed carved from stone. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Sarah saw a small log cabin that looked sturdy but lonely, sitting in the middle of vast white emptiness. Daniel helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag inside, showing her around the simple 2-room cabin with the same mechanical distance he had shown throughout their journey. There was a main room with a fireplace, table and chairs, and a smaller bedroom off to the side. Everything was clean but bare, as if the life had been scrubbed out of the place along with the dirt. Daniel told Sarah she could have the bedroom, and he would sleep by the fire. He explained that the preacher from town would come the next day, Christmas Eve, to perform the marriage ceremony. Then he went back outside to tend to his animals, leaving Sarah alone in the cabin that was supposed to become her home. Sarah stood in the middle of that cold cabin and felt tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had not come all this way to give up before she even started. She unpacked her few belongings, and then set about exploring what supplies Daniel had in the cabin. She found flour, salt, a bit of sugar, some dried beans, and very little else. It was clear that Daniel had been living like a man who had stopped caring about anything beyond basic survival. Sarah had arrived too late in the day to do much, but she built up the fire and made a simple soup from the beans and some dried meat she found hanging in the cold room. When Daniel came back inside as darkness fell, he found hot soup waiting on the table. He looked surprised, as if he had forgotten that meals could be warm and ready when a person came in from the cold. They ate in silence, and afterward Daniel thanked her quietly before taking his bedroll and settling by the fire. Sarah went to the bedroom and lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howl outside and wondering what her life had become. The next day was Christmas Eve, and Sarah woke before dawn with determination burning in her chest. If this was going to be her life, then she would make it into something worth living, even if she had to do it alone. She found needles and thread in her bag, and some old fabric scraps in a trunk, and she spent the morning sewing while Daniel worked outside in the bitter cold. She made simple decorations from the scraps, cutting them into shapes and hanging them near the window. It was not much, but it brought a tiny bit of color and life into the bare cabin. She used the last of the flour and sugar to make simple biscuits, something special for Christmas Eve, even if they had almost nothing. When Daniel came in at midday, he stopped and stared at the decorations hanging in the window. His face did something strange, a flicker of emotion crossing his features before the stone mask settled back into place. He did not comment, just washed his hands and sat down to eat the biscuits Sarah had made. The preacher arrived in the afternoon, a kind-faced older man who seemed determined to make the simple ceremony as warm as possible, despite the obvious lack of feeling between bride and groom. Sarah and Daniel stood before the preacher in that small cabin and spoke their vows while the winter sun set outside, casting long shadows across the snow. Sarah's voice was steady even though her heart was breaking, because she was promising her life to a man who seemed to have no life left in him to share. Daniel's voice was flat and emotionless, going through the motions because it was practical to have a wife, not because he wanted one. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Daniel gave Sarah a brief, cold kiss that felt more like an obligation than anything resembling affection. The preacher left before dark to make it back to town, and Sarah and Daniel were alone again as husband and wife, two strangers bound together by words that felt hollow in the empty cabin. Sarah prepared a simple dinner, and they ate in the same heavy silence that had marked every meal. As darkness fell completely and Christmas Eve deepened into night, Daniel sat by the fire, staring into the flames while Sarah cleaned up, and the loneliness in that cabin felt thick enough to touch. Sarah was washing the last dish when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was quiet at first, almost hidden under the crackling of the fire, but then it grew clearer. Daniel was crying, not loud dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that ran down his face while he stared into the flames. his shoulders shaking with grief he had clearly been holding inside for far too long. Sarah put down the dish and moved slowly toward him, unsure what to do but unable to ignore such raw pain. She sat down on the floor beside his chair and waited, giving him space but offering her presence. Daniel's voice came out broken and rough as he began to speak, the words pouring out like water from a cracked dam. He told Sarah about his wife Mary, about how much he had loved her and how her death had destroyed something fundamental inside him. He described holding his stillborn daughter in his hands and burying them both on a hill behind the cabin, and how since that day he had just been going through the motions of living without actually being alive. He said he had sent for a mail-order bride because he knew he needed help on the ranch, but he had not expected to feel anything ever again. Then Daniel turned and looked at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time since she had arrived, and his voice changed. He told her he had been watching her throughout the day, had seen her trying to bring life into his dead cabin with her scraps of fabric and her determination to make something out of nothing. He said he had tasted hope in those simple biscuits she made from his bare supplies, had felt something crack open in his chest when he saw those decorations hanging in the window like small flags of courage planted in the wasteland of his grief. Daniel told Sarah that she had come to his ranch with nothing but a worn bag and hope, and somehow that hope had reminded him that life could still have meaning, that Christmas Eve could still hold miracles, that his frozen heart might still be capable of thawing. He said that when he watched her speaking her marriage vows with such dignity and strength, despite marrying a man who had given her no reason to hope for happiness, he had seen not just a practical arrangement but a blessing he did not deserve. Sarah's own tears were flowing now as she listened to this broken man finding his way back to feeling. She took Daniel's rough, work-worn hand in both of hers and told him her own truth. She said she had come west with nothing but hope, because hope was all she had left after years of grinding poverty and loneliness in Philadelphia. She told him she understood grief and loss, understood what it meant to keep going, even when life felt pointless and empty. She said she had not expected love or romance from this marriage, had only hoped for a chance at a life that meant something more than factory work and slow starvation of the soul. But sitting there on Christmas Eve in a small cabin in Wyoming, holding the hand of a stranger who had just let her see his broken heart, Sarah realized that maybe they could build something real together, not a fairy tale or a romance from books, but something honest and true, two wounded people helping each other remember how to be alive again. Daniel squeezed Sarah's hands and asked if she would be willing to try, to give him a chance to be a real husband, instead of just a stone man going through motions. Sarah nodded and smiled through her tears, telling him she would try if he would, that they could figure it out together one day at a time. They sat together by the fire for hours that Christmas Eve, talking in ways Daniel had not talked since Mary died, and Sarah had not talked since her parents passed. They shared their stories, their fears, their small hopes for the future. As midnight approached and Christmas Day began, Daniel stood and pulled Sarah to her feet. He held her properly for the first time, not a cold, obligatory kiss, but a real embrace that spoke of gratitude and possibility, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. He whispered against her hair that she was not just a practical arrangement or a worker for his ranch, but a blessing that had arrived when he needed it most, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the hope she carried inside her. That Christmas marked the true beginning of Daniel and Sarah Crawford's life together. The weeks and months that followed were not always easy, as both of them carried scars that took time to heal and trust that had to be built slowly through daily acts of kindness and patience. But they worked side by side through the brutal Wyoming winter, and with each passing day the cabin became more of a home and less of a tomb. Sarah's touches were everywhere, in curtains she sewed for the windows and quilts she made for their bed, and meals that brought warmth and flavor back into Daniel's life. Daniel began to smile again, first just small quirks of his lips, and then real, genuine smiles that lit up his whole face when Sarah said something funny or when he came in from work to find her humming while she cooked. They planted a garden together when spring came, working the soil and talking about their dreams for the ranch, and maybe someday a family if they were blessed with children. The loneliness that had filled that cabin like cold air gradually disappeared, replaced by something warm and alive and real. By the time the next Christmas arrived, the Crawford ranch was transformed. The cabin was filled with life and color, with curtains and decorations, and the smell of fresh bread. Daniel and Sarah had become true partners, working together and laughing together, and building a life that neither could have created alone. On Christmas Eve, Daniel gave Sarah a gift he had carved himself during long winter evenings, a beautiful wooden box with her initials on the lid. Sarah gave Daniel a shirt she had sewn from fabric she had ordered special, fitting it perfectly to his frame. But the real gift they gave each other was simply the life they had built, the love that had grown from nothing but hope and willingness to see each other truly. They stood together on that second Christmas Eve, looking out at the snow-covered land that had seemed so harsh and lonely a year before, and now it looked like home. Daniel told Sarah again that she was his blessing, his reminder that life continues and hope is never wasted. Sarah leaned against her husband's strong shoulder and knew that taking that leap of faith, boarding that train with nothing but a worn carpetbag and hope in her heart, had been the best decision she ever made. Years passed, and the Crawford ranch prospered under Daniel and Sarah's combined efforts. They had 3 children who grew up knowing their mother had been brave enough to travel across the country alone, and their father had been strong enough to let love back into his broken heart. The children heard the story every Christmas Eve about how their parents had found each other, about hope and blessings, and how the hardest times can lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Daniel never forgot that first terrible Christmas Eve when Sarah arrived, and he had been so lost in grief he almost missed the miracle standing right in front of him. Sarah never forgot the moment Daniel finally looked at her and saw not just a mail-order bride or a practical arrangement, but a blessing worth cherishing. Their love story became local legend in Hollow Creek, the tale of the seamstress from Philadelphia and the grieving rancher who found each other when both had almost given up on life having anything good left to offer. When they were old and gray, sitting together on the porch Daniel had built years earlier, visitors would sometimes ask Sarah if she had been frightened making that journey west to marry a complete stranger. Sarah would smile and take Daniel's weathered hand in hers and say that yes, she had been terrified, but hope had been stronger than fear, and that hope had carried her exactly where she needed to be. She would say that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is keep hoping, even when there is no logical reason to hope, because hope is the thread that connects us to our futures and to each other. Daniel would add that sometimes blessings arrive in unexpected packages, looking like nothing special until you have the wisdom to truly see them, and that the most important skill in life is learning to recognize blessings when they appear, instead of walking right past them in search of something that looks more impressive. And so the story of Sarah and Daniel Crawford lives on as a reminder that Christmas miracles are real, but often come quietly, wrapped in courage and hope rather than in bright paper and bows. It teaches that being a blessing to someone else often means simply showing up with whatever you have, even if all you have is hope and determination. It proves that the darkest nights can lead to the brightest mornings, that broken hearts can heal if given patience and kindness, and that 2 people who start with nothing but hope can build something beautiful together. Sarah was a mail-order bride who arrived with nothing but a worn carpetbag and hope in her heart, and on Christmas Eve Daniel looked at her and saw the blessing that would save his life and give him reason to live again. Their story echoes across the years, reminding us all that hope is never wasted and blessings are never accidents, and that the greatest gifts we can give each other are the simple acts of seeing truly, loving honestly, and choosing hope, even when darkness seems overwhelming.